As someone with the type of autism that makes you want to catalog and rate everything, I do fear that rating websites are rotting our brains a bit. And this is coming from someone who has a Letterboxd account, a Goodreads account, a Rate Your Music account, an Album of the Year account. So I am the target demographic. I'm speaking to myself here, and there's no judgment being passed. Well, there is some judgment being passed, but again, I'm in the same boat as everyone else here. I just want to start a conversation about how these websites are potentially negatively influencing how we interact with art and media. I think I should start with, though, explaining what I think the purpose of these websites is. I know for myself, and I'll use Letterboxd as an example. I find the primary utility in Letterboxd is that I can catalog movies and then the website will let me sort those movies by genre, by the year they came out, and some other data points. I like the features where you can see all the movies an actor or actress has been in, all the movies someone has directed or written or produced. I like the data the website gives me about percentage of filmography watched. I like how Letterboxd tells me where movies are streaming. And really, most importantly, is the user generated content and how it helps me discover new movies. Just to clarify, this is not a plug for Letterboxd. I don't care if you use it, but this is just me explaining why I find it to be useful. It's the same with Goodreads and Rate Your Music. I like seeing what there is a general consensus on. And again, to touch on it, really the best part for me is the user generated content, reviews, and most importantly for me, lists. I love lists. I love themed lists. I love lists that people make of their favorite movies. I eat them up. I'll never watch all the movies in a list or anything, but I just it scratches that itch for me. I love it. And I do think it's useful to ask here, what does a star rating mean? You know, 1 signifies something's bad, 5 signifies something that's really good. But I do think it's useful to point out how vibes based this is. Not everyone uses it as an objective measure of artistic quality. I mean, I don't. I've seen some people rate movies that are pretty bad 5 stars because it's nostalgic for them. There's a lot of noise surrounding that rating. So, for example, let's take Barbie and Oppenheimer. Barbie is rated 3.8 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd, while Oppenheimer is rated 4.2 out of 5 stars. What does this mean exactly? Does it mean that Oppenheimer is 10% better or 10% more enjoyable? 10% more artistically meaningful? I know that's like on the surface a very silly question, but ratings tend to be something that we all accept socially, but nobody can actually quantify what it means specifically. And this doesn't just apply to Letterboxd. Goodreads is notorious for having complete nonsense ratings where every book that is even mid at best is automatically, 3.6 out of 5 stars. But I mean, just to give another example, let's take Jennifer's Body, the cult classic that was famously absolutely trashed by critics on release. If you go to Rotten Tomatoes, the critic score for Jennifer's Body is 46%, and the audience score is 35%, which is pretty terrible. Yet, you go to Letterboxd and it sits at a 3.4 out of 5, which, if we're just directly translating that to a percentage, would be a 68%. And considering that really only the most esteemed movies on Letterboxd get above a 3.4 is more like an 70-80% in Rotten Tomatoes terms. So Jennifer's Body has a 40% ish on Rotten Tomatoes, and the equivalent of give or take an 80% on Letterboxd. What do we do with that information? Is one site right and the other wrong? In this case, yes, because I think Jennifer's Body is an amazing movie and the critics are absolutely wrong. But my point more so is that our opinion of art can change drastically over time. The rating on Rotten Tomatoes for Jennifer's Body is no longer helpful because the movie has gone under such a big critical reevaluation. With music, some of the most famous pop songs still have low ratings on Rate Your Music because it was super cool to hate pop music in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Another concern I have in a similar vein is how avant garde or outsider art is treated on these websites. Media that's controversial, that pushes boundaries. Most artists in this vein are appreciated eventually. Someone like John Waters, who directed Pink Flamingos, or avant garde band Liturgy, who were only appreciated after they got shit on for a decade. My point here being that all ratings we assign something are based on that specific moment in time. And of course, we don't know if something will be reappraised in the future. And it's really oftentimes once an artist has put out a ton of different things that we can actually go back to their early stuff and appreciate what they were doing because we have hindsight and we can, our perception has changed over time. So it's not that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it's important when we look at things that are older that we sort of understand how opinions, especially on art, change over time. And this is especially the case when we try and interpret things like the top 100 movies on Letterboxd, or the top 100 albums on Rate Your Music, or the top 100 books on Goodreads. And the worst thing I think we can do is look at these lists as being objective. Even if you think art can be quantified objectively and rated, rating aggregate websites do not give you objective lists of the top 100 of anything. And it's especially important to consider that only people who care enough to rate albums or books or movies use these websites. My mom, who only watches rom coms, does not use Letterboxd, so her love of those movies will not be represented. My friend, who only reads crappy crime dramas, doesn't use Goodreads. These websites curate a specific kind of user. We see this especially looking at Goodreads' best books list. All tea, all shade, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows is not the second best book of all time. Sarah J. Maas and Rick Riordan should be nowhere near the top 10, even the top 1,000 of best books of all time. And like Heartstopper Volume 4 at number 12, please be for real. Again, though, Goodreads curates a user base of people who love young adult novels, but I don't think, even as someone who's generally subjectivist when it comes to art, that this is anywhere near the best books of all time. Similarly, while Rate Your Music in their top 100 albums of all time list has good and important albums represented, the website is extremely slanted towards rock and hip hop. When you look at their list, there's no classical music represented, and there's basically no pop. And when you scroll through the list, there's only 7 or 8 albums made by women. And I definitely think that signifies some male bias happening here. I'm not saying I expect it to be a 50-50 split equally between genders, but I do think that women have made at least more than 10% of the best albums of all time. With Letterboxd, they don't have a way to sort by quote unquote best movies. Their top list just shows the most popular movies, so just all the movies people have decided to rate, which I do like. So I instead sorted a list of all movies on Letterboxd with at least 1 million ratings, and then I sorted it by the highest average rating. And looking at this list, similar to Rate Your Music, nothing about this list is necessarily extremely objectionable. Again, I mean, I could point out how only give or take 2 of the 15 movies here have women in leading roles or that are about women, but I do think that would be a bit of a tired critique. So there's 2 things I want to specifically point out, and the first will be quite short, but again, I just want to question what exactly does best mean here? Is it most artistically significant? Is it most important? Most relevant in the cultural zeitgeist? There's not a clear definition of what exactly we are talking about here. The second thing that I want to point out here, though, is that rating websites can be self reinforcing in ways that we don't instinctually think about. Just to make a short tangent, I do think that if you want to get into critically evaluating music or movies or books, it's good to consume, as you refer to it, the canon. For those of us in the West, it's the Western canon. And it's not necessarily because these are the best that books and movies have to offer, although many of them, or some of them at least, are the best within their genre, but it's also because many of these books are important to understanding how art is made today. Media has always been referential. Books are based off of other books, which are based off of other books, and the same is with music and movies. I recently read Pride and Prejudice for the first time. Do I think it's the greatest romance novel ever written? Probably not, but it is good, but it's also the basis for every single romance novel written after it. Like, the enemies to lovers genre came from Pride and Prejudice. Romeo and Juliet, for example, continues to be the basis for an entire subgenre of romance novels based on people from, families that are enemies. So, with the Western canon, while it can be exclusionary and to a degree overhyped, I will always be a proponent of reading or watching or listening to the classics, if only to give you a better understanding of the media you like today, which is likely based to some degree off of those classics. But to get back to how these lists can be self reinforcing, any piece of media that you see at the top of a best of list then gives you expectations that it will be amazing. For example, you have the top 20 movies of all time. You now go into those movies expecting them to be the best. If you see a bunch of movies that are at the top of a list, you watch all of those, you probably rate many of them positively because many of them are good. You, for a time, don't watch other things. And so these movies tend to accumulate many positive ratings because they're at the top of a list, leading them to remain at the top of a list. And it's not to say that you shouldn't go watch 12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men is an amazing movie. I love it quite a lot, but it's good to approach everything with a blank slate. Don't be swayed by other people telling you to like something and then liking it because other people told you to like it, etc., etc. And also explore movies that you wouldn't otherwise watch. Consume media from a variety of viewpoints so that you can have a well rounded point of view. It's disappointing to me when people just watch one type of movie or listen to one type of album because that's what people tell them they're supposed to listen to or watch. Go consume whatever you want. Be free. And what I'm trying to say in part is that I think there is a good and a bad way to use these websites. For example, with Letterboxd or Rate Your Music, when I watch or listen to something, I'll look at the reviews at the top. I will see if there's any reviews that I think are particularly well written. And if I find one that's well written or that speaks to my experience that I can relate to or that I just think is good, I'll follow them and then I'll look at what they say about other stuff. And it's really a way of curating a list of people who you think are smart or funny and just looking at what they say, seeing if you can gain any insight from what that person saw in a movie that you might not have, or an album that you might not have. It's really good to just compare your experience of something with someone else when you know that person is similar to you, or maybe the complete opposite, and just seeing what they have to say. I do finally just need to rail against the scoring system for a second. I've seen a lot of people on these websites who seemingly rating art is their obsession. I see people sometimes who rate 4 or 5 albums a day or 4 or 5 movies a day. And it concerns me. It concerns me because I feel like we're reaching a tipping point where all this rating and scoring nonsense is turning into an unhealthy obsession. And I am the person again who is on 4 different websites for rating things. And so I am the first person to say that I think it is completely reasonable that we want to show or signify whether we like or dislike something, or we like categorizing things. I get it. It brings clarity when we can understand why we enjoy or don't enjoy something. And it's nice to have a list of your favorite movies or songs that you can easily access. But I worry about the need some people have to place a grade on art. And need we forget that the purpose of art, the purpose of books, movies, music, is to enrich our lives, whether through artistic achievement or just through enjoyment. And I don't think that mechanically dissecting every single part of a movie or an album enriches your life. I don't think that. And it's also enforcing rules onto art when art is not supposed to have rules. Something another YouTuber I watch said, it's by Robert Welsh. He's a beauty YouTuber, and he says it's essentially that makeup doesn't have rules, but it does have a theory. And I think that applies equally to media. Movies, books, art, it doesn't have rules, but it does have a theory. And so there are ways that are better when it comes to creating art. But that's not a rule. And so when we systematize art into all of these little grades that we assign it, we end up imposing rules onto something that is not supposed to have any. And I think it ends up fundamentally misinterpreting all the rating nonsense. It misinterprets why we consume art to begin with. And so I guess my point is that I think we just need to stop taking these websites so seriously. I don't know. Or maybe we're not taking them seriously enough. Who knows? I don't know anything.